Welcome to Monarch Matters, a podcast by Monarch PSG, where we explore the intersections of environmental sustainability, climate action, and social justice. Each episode dives into pressing issues, innovative solutions, and the stories driving change in our communities and beyond. Whether you're an advocate, a learner, or someone curious about making a difference, you're in the right place. Let's transform awareness into action, because what matters to the planet matters to us all. We're bringing you scripted episodes voiced through AI technology powered by AIVOV and/or Voice Studio. Thank you for joining us. Let's get started. Welcome to this episode of Monarch Matters, Sustainable Food Systems, Innovations for a Healthier Planet, where we delve into sustainable food systems inspired by articles from Cornell professor Dr. Marianne Krasny. We'll explore innovative solutions like alternative proteins, reducing methane emissions from cows, and strategies to tackle food waste. Plus, we'll examine how media can drive plant-forward diets to combat climate change and shape a healthier, more sustainable future.
Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today we're tackling the world of alt proteins.
Alt proteins.
Alt proteins. And, we're not just talking about the trendy plant-based burgers here.
Oh, okay.
We're going deep.
Ah,
Plant-based, lab-grown, the whole shebang.
I like it.
We've got some great sources to dig into today, including some insights from Marianne Krasny at Cornell University.
Oh, yeah, she's been featured in Forbes a lot talking about this.
Exactly. Plus, we've got articles on, well, just about everything. The science, the economics, and, we've got to talk about those cow emissions, right?
Of course, of course.
Okay. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's start with the basics. When we say out proteins, what are we actually talking about?
Well, it's a pretty broad term. Basically, any protein source that doesn't come from traditional animal agriculture.
So, like, more than just swapping a beef burger for a bean burger.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about plant-based options like tofu, sure.
Right.
But also things like fermented proteins, biomass fermentation, and even cellular-based proteins, lab-grown meat.
So less about swapping and more about, like, entirely new ways of making protein.
Exactly.
Some of this stuff sounds like it's straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right. It might sound futuristic, but the concept isn't actually new. Tofu, for example, has been around since 965.
Wow, really?
Yeah, originated in China. And get this, Benjamin Franklin was a big fan of soybeans.
No way. That's amazing.
I know, right?
I always pictured him with a kite, not a soybean.
Right. But, the technology has definitely come a long way.
Yeah, for sure. But why is everyone suddenly so interested in alt proteins now? What's driving this whole alt protein movement?
Well, there are a few big factors. The biggest one is the environmental impact of traditional meat production.
Okay, right, makes sense.
Raising livestock, it contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, all sorts of environmental problems. Studies have actually shown that shifting to alt proteins could really reduce these impacts.
Yeah. In fact, one of the Forbes articles even said that investing in plant-based meats could be more effective at cutting emissions than some other things, like changing concrete production.
I saw that, yeah. And it's not just the environment either. Alt proteins have this huge potential to help with global food security, especially for people in areas with food shortages.
Yeah, absolutely.
Take molecular farming, for example. It basically uses plants to produce specific proteins, like tiny protein factories.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's really sustainable, can be scaled up, and could be really cheap to produce.
So it's like a win-win.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, that all makes sense. But let's be honest, I've even been a little skeptical of some of those plant-based burgers.
Yeah.
Like all the ingredients, I'm not sure they're really that much better for you than a regular burger.
That's a fair point. I think a lot of people have that same question. But there's actually been some encouraging research. There's this Stanford study where they found that people who ate Beyond Burgers regularly didn't have any negative health outcomes.
No kidding.
Yeah. Some even saw improvements in some of their cardiovascular risk factors.
So it's possible that these things are not just better for the planet, but better for our hearts, too.
That's what the research is showing.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of plant-based meat alternatives often have more fiber, less saturated fat, fewer calories than meat.
Okay, right. Makes sense?
And let's not forget about our old standbys, like beans, lentils.
Yes, of course.
Those are packed with nutrients, naturally unprocessed.
Yeah, that's a good point. But, there's a lot of pushback against this whole alt protein thing, particularly from, the meat industry.
Yeah, of course.
One article even talked about how the National Cattlemen's Beef Association was really opposed to the Department of Defense even considering cell-based meat for troops.
Right.
So, like, Why are they so against this?
Well, the meat industry, it's powerful, and they're definitely protective of their business. I think they see alt proteins as a threat,
Sure.
and we've already seen them lobbying for things like labeling
Oh,
restrictions.
wow.
Yeah. Or even trying to ban some alt proteins, calling them unnatural or even dangerous.
Interesting tactic. It does seem a little ironic, though, because some of the biggest meat companies, JBS and Tyson, are actually putting money into these cell-based meat startups.
Yeah, I know, right? It's definitely a complicated situation.
For sure. So bringing Marianne Krasny back into the conversation, it seems like she's really focused on the idea of informed consumption, like really understanding what we're eating, not just jumping on a trend.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. She's arguing that we need to look at the whole picture, not just blindly accept or reject these new technologies. We need to think about the real costs of meat production, not just the price tag.
Right. The environmental impact, the health implications, the ethical stuff.
Exactly.
You know, one thing she said that really stuck with me is that lab-grown meat isn't necessarily unnatural. Like a steak made through molecular farming. It's chemically the same as a steak from a cow.
Yeah, it's just a different way of getting there.
Right, exactly. So all this considered, what can our listeners do to, navigate this whole complex alt protein world?
Honestly, I think the most important thing is to just stay informed. Learn about the different types of alt proteins, how they're made, what the benefits and drawbacks are. Then you can make choices that work for you and what you care about.
Okay, that makes sense. But beyond personal choices, are there things we can do, like policy-wise or something, that can help move things in a more sustainable direction?
Definitely. Marianne Krasny is a big proponent of policies that support the development of alt proteins. Things like funding research, giving tax breaks to startups,
Right.
and pushing back against those protectionist measures that benefit the meat industry.
And from an economic standpoint, it seems like alt proteins have huge potential. I think the Boston Consulting Group predicted the market could hit like $290 billion by 2035.
Yeah, you're right. So there's definitely more than just a fad. This is a serious thing with the power to really change the global food system.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about a lot. The types of alt proteins, the environmental and health benefits, the pushback, the whole informed consumption thing.
Huh.
But there's another side to this that we need to talk about. The counter-arguments to alt proteins.
Yeah. And these counter-arguments often center around one specific thing: cow burps.
Cow burps, really?
Yep, cow burps, or more specifically, the methane they release when they burp.
Okay. I gotta admit, that sounds a little funny.
I know, right? But the science behind it is serious. Cows, like other ruminant animals, they have this unique digestive system that relies on microbes to break down plants.
Okay.
And one of the byproducts of this digestion is methane, which is a greenhouse gas.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And while methane doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide, it's actually way more effective at trapping heat.
So cow burps are a real problem for the climate.
They are a significant contributor.
Yeah, okay. So what can we do about it?
Yeah.
I mean, can we stop cows from burping?
Well, we can't stop them entirely, but there are a bunch of things scientists are looking at to try to reduce those methane emissions. One approach is to change their diet.
So, feed them something that makes them burp less.
Yeah, exactly. Some types of seaweed, for example, have shown some promise.
Interesting.
But of course, we need to make sure that we're harvesting seaweed sustainably, because that could be a whole other environmental issue.
Right, of course. Are there other things they're trying, like beyond diet?
Yeah, there are some really cool things in development, like feed additives that stop those methane-producing microbes in their stomachs from doing their thing.
No way.
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah, there's one called 3-NOP or Bovaer that's been shown to reduce methane emissions by 45%. It targets the specific enzyme that the microbes need to make methane.
That's incredible.
It is. But of course, we need to do more research to make sure it's safe and sustainable in the long term.
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. What about other things, like technology or something?
Yeah, there's that too. Scientists are looking at things like breeding cows that naturally produce less methane.
So, low methane cows.
Exactly. And there are even vaccines in development that target those methane-producing microbes.
Vaccines for cow burps.
It sounds crazy, right? But it could be a game changer.
Wow. I've also heard about, wearable devices for cows that, capture the methane.
Yes. Those are in development too, but they face some challenges.
Yeah.
There are masks that capture and convert methane and tubes that collect it for biofuel.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, but it remains to be seen how practical and scalable these technologies will be.
Okay, that makes sense. But I guess the bigger question is, are all these efforts to, like, reduce cow burps even enough to offset the impact of beef production in general?
Yeah, that's the big question. And honestly, we don't have a definitive answer yet. It's not just the methane. It's the land use, deforestation, water consumption,
It's
waste.
everything. In fact, one of our articles mentions a lawsuit against JBS, that huge meat producer, because of their claims about having net zero emissions goals.
Yeah, there's definitely growing pressure for the meat industry to be more accountable. People are starting to understand the environmental impact of their food choices, and they're demanding transparency.
Absolutely. So does this mean we should all stop eating beef entirely?
I don't think it's about complete abstinence, but about making informed choices. In some parts of the world where people don't have many other options for protein, it's just not realistic to tell them to stop eating meat. But in places like the US, where we eat way more meat than we need to, cutting back on beef is really important if we want a more sustainable food system.
Okay, I see your point. And this brings us to another piece of the puzzle, food waste. It's a huge problem that sometimes gets overlooked in all this sustainability talk.
Absolutely. The numbers are pretty shocking. The US wastes something like 40% of all the food we produce. That's 108 billion pounds of food wasted every year.
That is shocking. Why are we wasting so much food?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. We buy too much, we don't store it properly, and we throw away perfectly good food just because it's past the best buy date.
And then there's the waste that happens, like, before it even gets to us, right? During
Yeah.
transport and processing and all that.
Exactly. It's a big problem, but the good news is that we can all do things to make a difference.
Okay, so what can our listeners do to reduce food waste at home? Give us some practical tips.
Well, start by planning your meals and making a list before you go shopping so you don't buy more than you need.
Okay, that makes sense.
And make sure you're storing your food correctly to prevent spoilage.
Like what kind of things?
Like keeping fruits and vegetables separate, knowing how to use the different parts of your fridge, and using your freezer more. And get creative with leftovers. Don't be afraid to experiment with new recipes or freeze extra portions for later.
Those are great tips. What about those best by and sell by dates on packaging? Do those actually mean the food is bad after that date?
That's a really common misunderstanding. Those dates are usually more about quality than safety. You should really use your senses to decide if something's still good.
So I can trust my own judgment.
Mostly, yeah. If something smells bad or looks moldy, obviously don't eat it. But don't be afraid to use your common sense. Those dates are more like guidelines than rules.
Okay. What about composting? Is that a good option for dealing with food scraps?
Composting is great. You can reduce waste and make nutrient-rich soil for your garden. If you have space, you can start a compost bin at home. Or a lot of cities have curbside composting programs.
Right. And if I can't compost, can I donate food?
Yes. Food donation is another great option. Support your local food banks, or there are apps like Too Good To Go that connect people with businesses that have extra food.
Okay, cool. So we've talked about things individuals can do. Are there any, like, bigger initiatives or policies that could help with the food waste problem more systematically?
Definitely. There's some momentum behind policies like the Food Date Labeling Act. It would standardize those date labels and make it easier for businesses to donate food.
That's great. It sounds like people are starting to take food waste seriously.
Yeah, definitely. And beyond legislation, there are all sorts of programs popping up. Some cities are making composting mandatory. Others are working with businesses to keep food waste out of landfills.
That's encouraging. It seems like there's a growing awareness of the need for a more sustainable food system overall.
Absolutely. And that's where the idea of plant-forward eating comes in.
So back to alt proteins, but with a broader focus on plant-based foods in general.
Exactly. It's not about going vegan or vegetarian necessarily, but about shifting the focus to plant-based foods and reducing our dependence on meat and dairy.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that we don't need animal products at every meal to be healthy and happy.
And the good news is, this doesn't have to be a sacrifice. There are so many delicious plant-based recipes out there.
Absolutely. And we've seen a huge increase in plant-forward recipes, in newspapers, online, everywhere. It's clear that people are interested.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It shows that people are making the connection between their food choices and the health of the planet.
It really does. And the more we normalize plant-forward eating, the more appealing it becomes. It creates a ripple effect that can have a real impact on our food
Oh,
system.
that's a great point.
It doesn't have to be like a huge change either, you know?
Yeah.
It can be as simple as just adding more plant-based meals to your week.
Right, like, wasn't there that Meatless Monday thing a while back?
Exactly. That's a perfect example of how small changes can add up.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be just one day, you know? Maybe try a new plant-based recipe every week or have some friends over for a plant-forward dinner.
I like that idea. And speaking of influencing others, Professor Krasny talks a lot about how it's not just about individual choices, but about getting other people on board too.
Yeah, she makes a good point about that. Research shows that people are more likely to make sustainable choices if they see their friends and family doing it.
So it's more about like a cultural shift than individual guilt.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of sustainability where everyone feels like they're part of something bigger.
I like that. So how can we encourage that kind of collective shift toward plant-forward eating?
It can be as simple as talking to people about it. You
Right.
know, share your favorite recipes, tell them about the environmental benefits, maybe invite them to try something new with you.
Right.
You might be surprised how open people are to it.
Yeah, for sure. What about like advocating for more plant-forward options in our communities? Like, can we make a difference on a bigger scale?
Absolutely. You can talk to restaurants and schools and businesses about offering more plant-based options,
Right.
support companies that are committed to sustainability, and let your elected officials know that you care about these issues.
It sounds like we could do a lot both on our own and by working together.
Yeah, and it's empowering to realize that the choices we make about food can actually have a real impact on the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about alt proteins, cow burps, and food waste. Before we wrap up, I want to go back to Professor Krasny for a minute.
Yeah, she's got so much great insight on all this.
One thing she really stresses is the importance of being an informed consumer, like really understanding what goes into our food choices.
Yeah, she wants us to think about the whole picture, where our food comes from, how it's produced, the impact it has on our health and the environment and society.
So it's not just about the price tag, it's about seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about making choices that align with our values and realizing that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
And she also talks about being open to new technologies and innovations in the food space.
Right. She reminds us that the way we produce food is constantly changing, and we need to be open to new solutions that can help create a more sustainable and just food system.
So finding a balance between tradition and innovation.
Yeah, exactly. Honoring our culinary heritage while also embracing new possibilities.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from lab-grown meat to cow burps to the economics of alt proteins and the problem of food waste. Before we sign off, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think it's important to remember that every meal is an opportunity to make a difference. You know, think about the impact of your next meal, not just on your plate, but on the planet. Could you make a swap even just once a week that's good for both you and the environment?
I love that challenge. It's a great reminder that we all have the power to make a difference with every bite we take.
Yeah, and those small changes can really add up over time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, we've given you a lot to think about today, from lab-grown burgers to cow burps to the economics of alt proteins and the challenge of food waste. But before we go, I want to circle back to Marianne Krasny one last time.
Of course, her work is so important.
One of the things she emphasizes is this idea of informed consumption. You know, really understanding the true cost of our food choices.
Yeah, she wants us to think critically about where our food comes from, how it's produced, what impact it has on our health, the environment, and society as a whole.
So it's about looking beyond the label and considering the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about making choices that align with our values and recognizing that our individual actions can have a ripple effect.
Right. And she also talks about the importance of being open to new technologies and innovations in the food space.
Yeah, she reminds us that things are constantly changing and we need to be willing to embrace new solutions that can help create a more sustainable and equitable food system.
It's about finding that balance between tradition and innovation,
Right.
right? Honoring our culinary heritage while also being open to new possibilities.
Exactly. It's about finding a way forward that nourishes both our bodies and our planet.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it's not about being perfect, right? It's about trying new things, finding those plant-based meals that you really enjoy.
Yeah, exactly. And,
Yeah.
having fun with it.
Right, so we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. We've talked about lab-grown meat, cow burps, the economics of alt proteins, and food waste. It's a lot.
It is a lot. It's a complex issue with a lot of different angles.
Definitely. Before we wrap up, though, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I'd say just remember that every time you eat, you have the chance to make a difference. Think about the impact of your next meal, not just on yourself, but on the planet.
Hmm.
Could you maybe swap something out even just once a week for something that's good for you and the environment?
That's a great challenge, I think.
Yeah, even small changes can make a big difference in the long run.
I love that. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring the world of alt proteins and plant-forward eating. There's so much to learn and so many delicious things to try.
And remember, every meal is a chance to vote with your fork.
Well said. That's a great way to put it.
Eh.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of alt proteins. We'll see you next time.